All right, here we go. Welcome to Becky Live for September. My topic this week is, or this month is around potential. So we explore a topic where I share my insights and perspectives, and then we engage in dialogue together to go a little bit deeper and to kind of add your perspectives and insights to mine so we have a more complete picture. So I'm happy to be here with you today. A little bit about me. I'm Becky Andree. I'm the CEO of Vertical Leadership Consulting. I started the boutique leadership firm 3 years ago now because I was really concerned that the leadership development space was really too focused on content, what we need to know. And I really saw that there was this need to be focused on context, which is really about developing the complexity of thinking of our leaders and being able to make sure that they can handle the cognitive demands that shift and change as we have different leadership levels. So the work that my boutique leadership firm focuses on is developing flexibility and agility, both cognitively, behaviorally, and emotionally. But we bring in that expertise around that cognitive development so we can measure precisely what is required at different leadership levels, and then we can measure precisely what the gaps are and focus and accelerate development through those measurements to help them be able to meet the demands of their role. So I've been in leadership development for 25 plus years. I've developed so many programs, I probably couldn't even list them all. Some of them are still in use. I have one that I designed 12 years ago that is still being used by the company, and every divestiture that they've done, it's gone with that company. So it's kind of surreal to see that in action. But I also, from early on, kind of had this intuitive sense of developing in the context of creating those challenges and inviting leaders in to see things in new and expansive ways. So it's very rewarding to see that still out in the world and still to be contacted by people today to tell me their success stories. I'm also a mother. So I have a 16-year-old son. And I'm kind of seeing this potential growing and developing, watching his identity change, as well as watching his complexity of thinking change. So very honored to be part of that journey as well. And I will say that motherhood has really helped me kind of expand who I am and really begin to understand more about myself. But today we are going to cover potential. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is. I'm going to introduce a learning agility framework that comes from the academic world, and my colleague, Dr. Clayton, and I are very aligned on that. And so I'm going to share some of the things that he's written about it as well. And then we're going to talk a little bit about measurement and development. So that's my plan for our time together today. And I want to start just with potential. So, when you look in the dictionary, potential has a Latin origin of potent, which is being able. And when you look at it for today, we kind of look at it in different ways. We look at it as from an adjective perspective, having or showing the capacity to become or develop into something of the future. Or the noun, more latent qualities or abilities that may be developed and lead to future success. Now, typically within organizations, when we're looking at potential, we're looking at leadership potential, all right? And there seem to be all these magical formulas about, well, if the person has this or this, they're going to have potential. But even in the leadership academic side and even in the practitioner side, I mean, there are some similarities, but there are all these different views about what leadership actually is. But I want us to think about potential today as, being able to say that someone is capable of developing into a particular kind of person or a particular kind of ability. And if you say someone has potential, you really mean that they have the necessary abilities and qualities to become successful or useful in the future. Now, some of this potential is kind of within us, and either the environment might activate or support it. So we might think about it as kind of a butterfly. We start out as this caterpillar, but the caterpillar has to have access to food and shelter and has to not be eaten in order for it to turn into a chrysalis. And then that cocoon or chrysalis, which I can never say that word, has to also be supported by the environment, right? Like it can't be too hot, too windy, too cold. Like the conditions have to be just right. And then when we have the butterfly emerge, there's some struggle with it. All right. And then the butterfly is able to go on and happen. And when we think about kind of potential, for me, it really has a lot of adult development aspects to it, that there are these conditions that either help us develop into our potential or actually hold us back. And so we do have to be really realistic about the environment. And even with development, the amount of support that we get determines, but we also can't remove the tension or the struggle. The tension or the struggle is the part that kind of opens the wings and gets the blood flowing and the focus in the right areas. All right. So I want us to kind of have this image of what happens for a butterfly. Now, this just happens one time in a butterfly's lifetime. For us as adults, this happens multiple times. We shed different beliefs or ways of being and go into these different elements. And within leadership, there are different capabilities that are needed when you're a supervisor, a manager, a director, a VP, or a C-suite, right? There are different cognitive demands, and within different industries, there are also different cognitive demands. And so that's all a part of potential. So what I'm going to do is just walk us through a few ways that others have conceptualized potential, and then I'm going to move us into what I might recommend, where I'm actually aligned with my colleague, Dr. Clayton, on where we need to go. All right, so the first one I want us to take a look at is a Harvard Business Review article from 2017 that's titled "What Science Says About Identifying High Potential Employees." And so basically they break it down into three different things: that there's ability, there's social skills, and there's drive. So the ability is demonstrating knowledge and skills it takes to perform the key tasks. And they did acknowledge in the article that the more complex job it is, the single best predictor is cognitive ability. All right. And I want you to think about maybe some of the measurements that you've used to measure potential. Is it measuring cognitive ability? And in my experience with organizations, oftentimes there's not anything in there that's measuring that. Social skills, the ability to manage yourself and the ability to manage others. Again, the more complex the job, you have to be able to manage yourself first when facing that increased pressure, adversity, and still be able to act with integrity. You also have to be able to establish and maintain cooperative working relationships, build a network of contacts, and be influential with stakeholders. And then the third aspect the article talks about is drive. That you have the will and motivation to work hard, to achieve, and to do whatever it takes to get the job done. So conscientiousness, achievement, motivation, and ambition, which I do think drive, we're going to see some things shift and change. Yes, there is an element of drive, but this will take whatever it takes to get the job done. I think sometimes there are unrealistic expectations within organizations of what to do. But this definitely lined up with what I saw in typical kind of potential or identifying potential in organizations. We typically looked at results, ability, motivation, and emotional intelligence. All right. But what I also saw with kind of that focus is that bias is very easy to creep in. All right. A lot of these kind of things can be somewhat subjective. We aren't using real objective or validated measurements for these things. And so a lot of it is just left up to, does the manager think that this person has these elements? So while I do agree with, what Harvard Business Review has to say in 2017, I also think it's shifting and changing. And I also think that it is fraught with a lot of bias, which creates some problems. There was another article from Harvard Business Review. So I wanted to look at it. Well, what do people, if someone's trying to become a high potential, what do people say that they should have? And so I came across this article that was written in 2010. And so on the left-hand side, it's really about kind of like what is different about a high potential just versus someone who's maybe a high performer. That they deliver strong results, they're credible, which means they're competent, they're credible, they're trusted, they're influential. They seem to master new types of expertise, kind of letting go, adding on, strategic thinking. And they recognize that behavior counts, role model, and they're a role model and a teacher. And what they talk about is kind of high potential is what they propose is that high potential is kind of hardwired in, which I always worry a little bit about hardwired. I think that doesn't tell the whole story, but these things seem to make sense, that they have a drive to excel, that they're really driven to succeed. They go that extra mile, they make sacrifices. You look at the catalytic learning capabilities. So they scan for new ideas. They have the cognitive ability to absorb those new ideas, and then the common sense to translate that learning into some type of productive action. You see an enterprising spirit where they're searching for productive ways to blaze new paths. They take on challenges. They leave their comfort zones in order to advance. You also see some of this dynamic sensors where the authors describe it as kind of they're able to skirt these risks. So they have a feel for timing. They have an ability to read kind of the situation, and assess what's really going on and have a nose for opportunity. So, I think some of these elements are there as well. I also came across an article from the Center for Creative Leadership. This is the one article that I won't be sending or won't be putting a link in the chat about. The other two, I'll post the link to the articles because there's not much more than this quote. It's the only reason. But I did really appreciate what George Hollenbach had to say. Be careful not to confuse your high potentials with your high professionals, also known as high performers. This is a risk, especially in organizations that tend to put a premium on technical skills. So both high potentials and high professionals are high learners and high performers who can deliver a lot of value, but a high potential tends to be more broad and adaptable in their learning and skills, while high professionals have narrow but deep subject matter expertise. So your high potentials have tremendous learning agility, which is why it's often said that great leaders are great learners. And so it just has me so curious, the foundation of my leadership boutique firm is really continuous learning. And we use a process called virtuous cycle of learning, where we get people in the habit of this iterative challenge and this learning so that we're developing the flexibility cognitive, behaviorally, and emotionally. And yet, when I look at what organizations do, we've had so many people talk about the importance of learning. Peter Senge, lots of others have been talking about this for a long time, and yet we still struggle to kind of put that learning at the center. And I feel like we miss out on both developing that cognitive ability, because it's that deep learning and that continual learning that helps build that cognitive shift. But we're also missing out on awareness. I've talked with many of my leaders about this. We outsource our awareness to metrics, which we should be using metrics, but it's almost like they just want the metrics to give them the answer, or they want an outside consultant to give them the answer. And so we're not developing kind of real awareness, where if we could just focus on becoming more ongoing learners and understanding that leadership isn't an end state, there's always a growth edge, always something that we're growing into, I feel like we'd be really far ahead. So I'm going to move into kind of what my colleague, Dr. Clayton, has written about recently. It might have been within maybe the last 2 years, but we definitely are kind of aligned on some of the things that we've read and some of the things that we're seeing. And Dr. Clayton takes more of a programmatic approach. I'm looking more at, and I might even say it's beyond programmatic. I'm looking more at, within an organization, what needs to happen, or within an individual leader needs to happen. But I do think learning agility is the key point. And this is adapted from his article, How Not to Be a Toxic Leader, which I will put a link in the chat for you. It really is a great article that really brings together some of the dilemmas that we're seeing in leadership right now, where we kind of have these superhero leaders that think they need to have all the answers on their own. And so they're not looking outside of themselves for the answers. And then we also have some personality derailers that are getting in the way. But we can't, he does a really nice job of explaining how we all have elements of those in us. So we have to be careful with those labels and that type of thing. So it goes into much more than this, but at the end, he really does talk about how we need to start selecting and developing leaders in different ways. And he suggests this learning agility, which comes from a couple of different academic articles as well. And so when I send out the recording of the video, I'll include links to those articles as well. But it breaks it down into 5 different things that we really should be developing leaders to have results agility so that they can deliver results in challenging first-time situations. There's so much disruption going on, and some of my colleagues call this the decade of disruption, that leaders have to be prepared to be doing things for the first time. Self-awareness is really a key thing, the extent to which you know your strengths and weaknesses. And I know Dr. Clayton has done a great talk on how we need to stop creating Superman leaders and we need to develop Avengers instead. And this is what I see as well, is that we really need to have this self-awareness of what's going on. And then the mental ability to examine problems in unique and unusual ways. And this is kind of where, I specialize in, is this cognitive shift. What are you seeing? What are you capable of? And then how do we create learning that you're motivated to go into that will create conditions for that mental agility to develop? And so sometimes we have to develop up. Sometimes we have to learn how to translate back, right? So it's figuring out what that leader needs and how they need to move in different ways. People agility, a skilled communicator can work with diverse types of people. Really, leadership vendors have been primarily focused on this, which we do need, but is one part of what leadership really needs to have. And then changeability, the ability to experiment and be comfortable with that change and to not feel like you have to have all the answers, but instead to activate those answers through other people. And there are some underpinning from my other colleague, Ron Warren, that's in, I think it's called Personality at Work is his book. But he and Dr. Clayton references his work when he talks about this learning agility, but it does really help us help some of these personality derailers and help soften those edges and help them to be more successful in these leadership roles. So I'm just going to talk about typically how I measure things. So I've told you that I primarily focus on cognitive. We do some behavior. What I find is sometimes it's the cognitive level that's getting in the way of activating the right behaviors. Sometimes the behaviors are actually preventing the cognitive from developing. So I like to look at it from multiple different avenues so that I can see and kind of have a more complete picture on where they're at and where we might need to go. So I use 3 primary measurement tools. And again, there are more out there. So I'm not just advocating these. These are just the ones that I have found help me get to these different agilities, but also are don't just have a slick marketing brochure. Like, they have a lot of depth. They're very validated. And they've been repeated in their success. And I have other colleagues that are seeing the same types of successes. So for the cognitive, I've talked about this before when I talked about complexity of thinking. I use the leader decision-making assessment. It gives me a lot of different information. And through the debrief, it becomes kind of evident how self-aware they are, but it really does focus on the mental agility. And it provides a lot of opportunities for us to look at their change agility and leveraging kind of collaborative capacity, contextual thinking as a way to kind of move into those different agilities. For the LMAP 360, is a personality 360 that I really appreciate. It has really solid research about the personality derailers and the personality accelerators, and does a really nice job of not villainizing those derailers, being really clear about kind of their limitations, and then really clear steps on how to engage that person in moving that personality into a more effective way. So it looks at personality more from behaviors. How are you showing up? And really, the bottom line is sometimes people will say personality isn't, you can't modify or change it, but personality is really our behaviors. And we do modify and change our behaviors based on who we're interacting with. Even arrogant CEOs modify their personality when maybe they're talking with their spouse or their children. So we do have that ability to be flexible. And then behavior, I look at the leadership circle profile because I really like how it looks at how we can get derailed when we're controlling, complying, or protecting. And then it talks about, it's really grounded in solid research on what are the leadership behaviors that help us be scalable and sustainable. So you get to, and it also helps leaders. I like it because it works on the cognitive a little bit. It doesn't measure it, but it does create kind of a systems focus of leadership. So it does help create some abilities for me to help with mental agility. So, I mean, the bottom line for me for potential is that, if we could just get away from these competency structures or these static ways of viewing potential that, in my opinion, are very fraught with bias. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. But I do think this learning agility, if we could start to move leadership potential in this way, for me, everybody is a caterpillar. Everybody has the potential to become a butterfly. They have the potential to do this. It just depends. And that's where it comes back to some of what the Harvard Business Review articles are talking about, is that drive and motivation as well. I mean, we have to be clear about that is needed in the way we conceptualize leadership today. But I would also encourage us to think about, is our conception of leadership expansive enough? It's been very grounded in masculine ways of knowing. And there are some feminine ways of knowing. And again, it's not just male, female, it's thinking about that we each have those aspects within us. But for me, it's also activating kind of this acknowledging the tension between these masculine and feminine ways of being, and acknowledging that it's been out of balance in the leadership realm. But one thing that I see is that we really have too many people that stay caterpillars, and the world really needs them to become butterflies. And oftentimes they don't have the right supportive environment. They don't have access to resources, that sort of thing. So before we go into questions, I'm just going to wrap up with some upcoming events that I have. So in October, our Becky Live is going to be a little bit earlier, but I'm going to be talking about high quality connections. What is different between a draining connection versus an energizing connection? And I'm finishing up some of my PhD research, and I'm finding some fascinating things with high quality connections and developmental aspects. So I'll probably geek out with you a little bit and share that with you. October 21st, I'm speaking at Disrupt HR, and that video will be posted afterwards, usually a month later. So you could go out to Disrupt HR to watch that later on. I've also been invited to speak at the Leadership Circle Latin America Conference. So I'm really excited to be joining Bob Anderson and Cindy Adams on speaking about, I think my topic is on awareness. We're still kind of talking about that, but that's where it's landing. In November, I'm going to be talking with EQ Labs. I'll have 2 sessions that week where I'll be talking about advancing leaders' thinking capabilities to thrive in a complex world. November 11th, I'm going to be offering a program through Michigan Lean Consortium, how we're all facing staffing problems, how Lean can help, and I'll bring in some organizational, behavioral, academic things as well. And then November and December, we'll do live again. You'll notice they're also a little bit earlier in the month. November, I'm going to talk about tension. We kind of are embedded in living in tension today. And so I want us to talk about kind of what's the good, the bad, and the ugly of it, and how do we leverage it in a way that's generative. And then in December, I'm going to talk about learning. So I've talked a little bit about learning agility, but I'm going to really dive in a little bit more in December about how critical it is. And for those of you today or who are watching, thanks for letting me share my insights and perspectives on potential. Here's how you can contact me. I do try to post regularly on LinkedIn, either some articles that I find that are exciting or challenging, or just thought-provoking things as well. So would love to have you connect with me, at least on LinkedIn. That would be great. So I am going to stop recording now.